Okay, thanks to everyone for coming to, I think it's our 8th open meeting in Oakland. Today we're lucky enough to have Allison and David to talk about measuring progress. I don't have a lot else to say, so take it over, guys.
Cool, so just to introduce, for a little more background on us, and then I'm going to ask each of you, those that doesn't mind, to introduce yourselves quickly, so I think maybe not everyone knows who everyone else is. But my background is math academically, but more recently I've been doing predictive analytics and data science, specifically with Kaggle, which is a kind of a San Francisco data science startup. And Allison?
Yeah, so my background is also math. Right now I'm the director of research at Effective Animal Activism, which is a group that evaluates interventions and specific charities for cost effectiveness, basically in the area of reducing suffering from factory farming. So we look at all the data that there is, we try to figure out where is there data in support of effectiveness, how strong is that data, and what does that indicate that it makes sense for people to do. If what they're going to do for the animal movement is like donate money to somewhere, where should they donate that money? So here we are. We're going to talk to you about measuring stuff in activism.
Like that, it'd be nice to get a sense of who's here. So I know most of you, but
hi, my name is Cleo.
And I guess so. When recording, so if you don't want to be recorded, don't say anything. Cleo doesn't mind being recorded.
Okay,
apparently.
that's fine.
Okay.
I'm Chris. I'm Jonathan.
I'm Isabella.
Molly. Helen.
I'm Lisa.
Wayne.
Tack.
Alright, so I first want to kind of go a bit of an outline of what we're going to talk about. It should be roughly 15 or 20 minutes of talk and then a lot of time for discussion. So what's the goal? The goal, let's see, the way, I guess, a blog post that Wayne wrote recently, which some of you might have seen, about kind of outlining all the difficulties that arise in trying to do studies on things. That frames the goal for me really nicely, because I think the goal should be to avoid two bad extremes. Like one bad extreme being to kind of take that to mean that you can't trust any kind of studies, anything, measuring anything, that sort of just don't take that to mean it's all hopeless. But also don't believe everything you read. So just to talk about some examples and some tools that could help you kind of thinking better about the studies that you come across, or if DxE decides to study things for itself, and hopefully be sort of helpful as a framework for thinking about that. So then that's the goal. Then we'll talk about some things to look for in a study, like I said. Then the way that I think about what to study or what to measure is kind of what's your path to success, right? And I think DxE has a sort of a vision of what the goal is and how it's trying to get there. Just at least maybe not very precise, maybe very precise. Everyone has some kind of vision of what they want, and it could help to make that vision more precise and figure out what is that path that we're imagining, and then being able to measure progress along that path. So we'll talk about some examples of what you could measure, and examples of people measuring things, sort of organized by what the goal of the measuring is. So this is not an exhaustive list of goals that you could have in measuring, but one kind of goal is sort of A/B testing, right? So small changes to improve the impact of something. Then another is sort of measuring is what we're doing having, this is more like the path to success that I mentioned, is what we're doing having impact? Are we moving forward on the path to success? And then another example, again, not exhaustive, of what you might want to measure is something like what is this movement? Who are we made up of? What kind of people are we? And that could be useful for a number of things, like thinking about what's going to be most, what you're able to accomplish with the kind of the makeup that you have, or what kind of people will be most receptive to the message, or and we have some discussion questions, and we can also kind of have a pretty free-form discussion.
All right, so I want to talk about what to look for in a study. And what you're going to look for in a study has a lot, like it has to do with how to interpret information that you find out there in the world, and it also has to do with how should you conduct your own study. Say you found something and you want to measure it, what will other people be looking for? What makes your information look valuable to them? So one really crucial thing is that you want to see the method and the goals of the study, ideally stated somewhere before the study begins. And if you're conducting a study, it's really helpful to do that beforehand. And the main reason for this is that there's this phenomenon where people could only publish the studies that show what they want the study to show. And this does actually happen a lot in like hard science even. So all the more so when people are not trained researchers, people can be suspicious that like you're clearly coming to this with an agenda, right? You're an animal rights activist. You want to show that animal rights activism is useful. Well, if you stated beforehand that I'm going to do this study, I'm going to compare this thing to that thing, and whatever happens, this is what I'm going to report about the data that I gathered, then people are going to be a little less suspicious because you're saying that you're doing the study before you know whether the data is saying what you want it to say. And similarly, if you are collecting really a lot of data, so that like maybe you have 5 different ways you could measure or 500 different ways you could measure which of those things is more useful, then you might be able to sort of cherry pick and say, well, we measured the number of people who came to our meeting the next week because we happen to have a lot of people come to our meetings the next week after the actions that we liked the most. Even though we also technically measured the number of people who liked us on Facebook in the next week, which didn't really correlate with anything, although we really thought it should originally. So you want to put out your goals in a way that's maybe a little bit flexible, especially if you don't know which of these factors is actually going to be effective, but that acknowledges what they all are and says, you know, what's your criterion for saying this was successful? Do you want to see a change in just one of your 500 variables? No, probably not. Another is that data should be provided publicly so people can look at your analysis and redo it or check for themselves whether they think that the differences you found are significant. So you might not be able to provide all your data publicly. For instance, there might be privacy concerns. But if you're able to, or if you're able to aggregate the data in some way, like even just say, after this action we saw 15 people show up at our meeting, and after that action we saw 25, we didn't list who the people are, because obviously we don't want to put that on the internet without their permission. But that allows people to be like, okay, so that increase of X%, like that meant this many people, like it's really different if you went from 15 to 25 or 150 to 250, right? And providing more of your data can let people understand better how much of your conclusions are really valid and how much of your conclusions are from maybe natural variance. And lastly, you want to look at the study and you want to understand what the goals were and the domain where the study is applicable. So one really common example is there's a lot of psychology studies done by psychologists on undergraduates in college. Because it's really easy to get undergraduates in college to show up for half an hour and give them some free food. And those studies for like how do people cope with stress are super effective ways for people who are dealing with how undergraduates cope with stress to understand how people cope with stress, right? Like that might be really helpful for the campus wellness organization. But it might not be the case that like 60-year-old people cope with stress in the same way as those 20-year-old undergraduates did. And so with a lot of studies, there's going to be like no problem applying them to the domain that's really where the study was done. But there's going to need to be a lot of skepticism if you try to take those findings far outside their domain. And And people might try to imply that their findings can go way outside the domain where the study was done. People like to be like, well, I found this out in my psychology study. When maybe they only found it out about undergraduates. Oh, so we were supposed to go through before. This was about stating what your goals are. So before you do the study, you think jelly beans cause acne, you send it to the scientists to investigate, they found a link. So this is p greater than 0.05 is statistical significance jargon, or there is no more than a 5% chance that, well, in this case, there's more than a 5% chance that any link between acne and jelly beans was chance, was just random variation. Instead of settling it, they checked it out for here's 10 types of jelly beans. They didn't find any significant links. Here's 10 more. They did find one. Green jelly beans, statistically significantly linked to acne. So, the headline in the paper the next day is that green jelly beans are linked to acne. Only a 5% chance of coincidence. But of course we did more than 20 tests. Which means that we would expect one of those tests, maybe even two of those tests, but you know, about one, to have come up with this finding even if there was no reason for it. So, you know, be skeptical if people didn't say what they were looking for before they gave you their study. All right, that's you again.
Great. So I guess this is, I talked about this a bit when I was opening, but like depending on what you're kind of measuring and why, knowing what kind of model you have of how the world works and what effect your actions are going to have in the world, both in the short term.
I take it back.
I think some people are having trouble seeing the screen.
Is it good if we tilt the screen one way?
If we tilt it, the video is not going to come up as clearly, so I actually prefer to keep it down. But I think bringing the shades down is a good idea. I should have done that earlier.
How did you think of that?
You just have to be 10 feet tall to work things.
Nice.
Chris, can you help me? Can we actually close that one too for you?
Oh yeah. Cool.
Much better.
So, I mean, we're trying to bring about some major social change in the way people think about animals, in the way people treat animals, in the way the law treats animals, and so on, right? And this is, whether it's a few years from now, or a few more years from now, or whatever, this is something that's relatively long-term. And so, how do we know the impact of what we're doing now on this long-term? So part of the answer is to kind of, like, build the path, right? Like, what is the path from here to where we want to get to? And then be able to measure progress along that path. So, I don't know the answer to that. I don't know what the path that DxE imagines is. Well, I know something about what the path that DxE imagines is, but I think it would be a pretty valuable exercise to kind of map out what it is, what really do we think the path is, and what can we measure along the way. So that'll be one of our suggestions. And then so one way you can think about the path is, so part of what you're trying to do is bring people into a movement, right? You're building a mass movement, so you want people to get into the movement. And there's this thing from marketing called kind of the conversion funnel that's probably going to be useful for thinking about people coming into the movement, right? So there's a lot of, again, just like the long-term goal, like a lot of steps between here and where we're trying to get to, there's a lot of steps between kind of someone starting out as sort of not knowing nothing about animals or not thinking about this issue at all and becoming actively engaged in the movement, coming to core meetings and doing the actions and becoming an organizer. Like, so the way marketers think about this is there's different steps on the path from kind of what they want, the action they're trying to drive is someone to buy their thing, right? Like, there's different paths on the way from being some random person to someone buying their thing, different steps you take. And Helen can probably help me because she's actually worked in marketing, which I haven't. Right, so like, there's people visit your website, and then that's good. That's like one of the steps on the way to buying your thing. And then they visit the part of the website where you can buy stuff, and then they put an item in their cart, and then but like only some portion of the people who visit the website put an item in their cart, and only some portion of the people who put an item in the cart make a purchase. And so what's your funnel, right? Like what's the, someone, and there could be different funnels, there could be people coming in kind of through different ways. Someone sees an action and they get inspired to care about this issue, and then they come to a meeting, and then, you know, now you've got someone who's seen an action and come to a meeting, and then, you know, maybe that goes well, and they come to another meeting, and then they actually do an action. So there's all these different levels of engagement that you can kind of track along. So like measuring how many people you have involved in different ways is probably a valuable thing.
So the first kind of measurement that we are going to talk about is A/B tests, which are tests that examine small changes to an action or to some materials that you're using. So your testing is poster A more useful than poster B, or is poster B more useful than poster A? So the most effective ways of testing and implementation are very similar. So the kind of the best example for like purity is that people who have a website that they're trying to sell something on or trying to get people involved with their action on, you could put up 2 versions of that website and you could randomly serve one or the other to half the people who come. And then you could be looking at your Google Analytics, checking which of the websites causes people to click more links. And then you could just keep the one that seems to be doing better. So that's like perfect in terms of the people who are engaged in this test are exactly the kind of people who randomly visit your website, or who visit your website through whatever means people are coming to your website. This is not at all different. But sometimes it's not easy to get feedback on the people who are going to see you in nature. You know, it's not easy before your mass march to get people who will be walking past your mass march to tell you which thing they're going to find more effective in convincing them. So you might have to go kind of outside that realm of perfect naturalism. Over many tests in different situations where you're testing the same kind of thing, this might lead to like a general theory of what's more effective, but it's basically just a test of really small changes in really particular applications. There's often no theory behind A/B testing. But if you were a marketing company and you had A/B tested websites for tons and tons of different companies, and you always found that the ones with big banners on the top were more effective than the one with no big banner on the top, you might stop even testing ones with no big banner on the top because you were just like, well, I've learned this thing. It really helps to have a big picture at the top of my website. So you might, as a movement, come to some point where we're like, oh, we've learned this thing. It's really much more effective to show images of happy animals than images of sad animals, because we found in all these different contexts that it's more effective. Or we might learn that it's really more effective only in certain contexts, and with each new context, we still need to test. So this is an example of an A/B test study, and it's actually one that DxE is planning to do. So there's a bunch of different persuasive images that you could use as an organization in your marches, in your social media. So you could use graphic images of factory farming. You could use, on the other hand, happy images of peaceful animals in contented situations. You could use appeals to authority. So for instance, this quote from Mahatma Gandhi, "The greatness of a nation and its moral progress can be judged by the way in which its animals are treated."
We know David doesn't like that one.
So that might be persuasive, not because it's a picture of animals, but because it places the movement in a context that people should respect. Or you might also compare to what happens when people are seeing no imagery put out by your movement, what happens when they're just seeing regular advertising. So DxE's planned test involves showing undergraduates mostly, I think, at the Berkeley campus, one of these pictures or other similar pictures. And this is a really good use of the test because they're showing 3 images from each of those above categories. so that they can tell that it's not just like this picture of pigs is less effective than that picture of a pig, but like in general, we have a little bit more context for like what a graphic image is. So they're going to show these pictures to undergraduates, and then they're going to ask them how much they agree or disagree with different pro-animal statements.
Oh, I was just going to say that in this context, it doesn't seem like unwarranted to use undergraduates, since like that's an age range that, you know, is like pretty close to like maybe a target audience for this type of outreach.
Right.
So it's not like a stretch, like, you know, we're really trying to get, like you said, like the 6-year-olds, but, you know, we're studying 18 to 22-year-olds. Like, that's a pretty good demographic for research, like what we're trying to get.
Yeah, in a lot of contexts, that's like the exact people that the animal movement is most heavily targeting, because they're most likely to be in a place in their life where they might want to make this change.
Become politically engaged, like virtually sounds good for that.
Engaged, start thinking seriously about issues as an adult without your like parents' overwhelming authority. So this undergraduate study is like relevant for a big part of DxE's target audience. So the other example I want to talk about is this study that the Humane League and Farm Sanctuary did, comparing different videos. So I want to first talk about what their context was, because one of the things I really like about the study is the study is done in an exact domain of implementation. So what they do is they have a program where they run Facebook ads, targeted again at a very young audience of women between 13 and 25 years of age, I think is the bracket that Facebook uses. And so they'll run ads that say, like, they have a picture of a singer, and they say, why did this guy stop eating meat? Click here to find out. And they'll target those and people who are fans of that guy, because Facebook will let you do that. And so people will click on this ad, and it'll take them to a page, and that page will show a video expose of factory farming. And of course, you can then like the video on Facebook, you can share the video on Facebook, you can also order a vegetarian starter kit, or another like meat-free guide, if you are moved by that video to want more information. So what they did was, they were considering 4 different videos as the video that the ad takes you to, and so they showed identical ads, but in versions that linked to 4 different videos when people clicked on the ad. And then they looked at the percentage of people who clicked on the ad, looked at the video, and then ordered the vegetarian starter kit. So that was the highest level of engagement that they could measure with Google Analytics. Now, of course, that's not a level of engagement that's like the ultimate goal, right? At rock bottom minimum, the ultimate goal is like actually get those people to become vegetarian. But really, you know, the goal might be get them involved in the movement, get them talking to their friends, get them to go out and make connections with people. But that's really hard to measure. And it would have been much more expensive to get a big study measuring whether people did this, because that requires them to actually follow up with you at a different time. So they got these different percentages for different videos ordering the starter kit. And they changed what video they're showing now based on which video had a higher percentage of people ordering the starter kit. And because they were doing this in the domain of implementation, they were able to do it with a lot of people watching each video. And so they had like pretty high certainty. So the p-value, for those of you who are statistically literate, was like 10 to the negative 15 between the 2 main videos in comparison. Some of the ads only went to 2 videos, and I don't really understand the rationale for that. But they were really incredibly unlikely that the whole difference between the effectiveness of these videos in this sense was due to chance. So they published the study, and they said in the write-up for the study that they also, you know, they don't know, did this actually make more people go vegetarian? Did this actually make more people involved in the movement? And they'd like to do follow-up studies. But as an easy first step, this was really good. And I'm very impressed by it.
Did they then generalize to the different kinds of videos? Like was one video more graphic, one video more animation, or was that the basis of the study, or was it just these specific 4 videos and therefore reasons?
They did not generalize, and that's a good point. So one reason they did not generalize, I think, is that the 4 videos were actually pretty similar. All of them showed graphic footage. The main difference between the 2 videos that they showed the most times was that one of them pretty much only showed graphic footage, and one of them also showed footage of animals in sanctuaries. So it would like start with the chicken in a sanctuary, talking about this individual named Chicken, and then show graphic footage of chicken farming.
And that was a video
more
that did better.
effective video.
Yeah.
Were they able to collect a video, like how long, how much of the video people watched?
They also did collect data about how much of the video people watched, but because they were using Google Analytics, it was kind of a weird kind of data because the data about how much of the video people watched was only for people who didn't bounce. And this is kind of a typical thing, but the bounce rate is something about how long you stayed on the page or whether you clicked something. So a very high percentage of people bounced, like 90% on every single video, which might just mean they didn't click anything after coming to the page. And the length of time that people watched the videos was actually not very different.
So the one that was more successful was the one with starting happy and then turning graphic.
Yeah, that was more successful than just starting graphic and remaining graphic.
I'm sorry, so the measurement was how many people ordered the starter kit? That was the goal.
That was the measurement they considered most reliable, and I think that's true that of their measurements, that was actually the most reliable one to look at. So what I also wanted to say was another way that they did not generalize and should not have generalized was they were looking at a particular audience of very young viewers, only female viewers, came to this video through a certain kind of Facebook ads. And one should not necessarily generalize this finding to, for instance, a co-ed audience, an audience that came to the video through some sort of in-person event or with people around to talk to about the video. You could certainly start here, but there's no reason that this necessarily applies to that. But it definitely does apply to their program. And they also did not compare in any way to a control. So they didn't have people click on an ad and then just be able to order a vegetarian starter kit without any other interaction. So they didn't try to claim that this means that showing this ad causes a certain amount of change versus not showing this ad. It was really just about which video is it most useful to show after you see this ad.
Do you know why they didn't do that?
I don't know why. A lot of the reason why organizations won't do that is they don't want to waste their advertising money on something that they feel pretty certain won't be as effective as what they're already doing. So you can be like, well, this other video might be as effective, but just showing them nothing is almost certainly not going to be effective. Right? That's the point of the control. And organizations are working with budgets and they don't typically have money set aside specifically for studies that just compare the effectiveness of their intervention to other possible interventions that also aren't very well studied at this point.
Do they have any kind of qualitative comparison between how banner ads typically, how much flow through they get to the vegetarian starter kit on the banner ad without a video relative to what they were getting with the videos?
I don't know. I don't know that they do ads that don't go to videos. Because I think they think the videos are the most likely to be effective.
I just imagine, I feel like I see like marketing posts, like infographics all the time about, Facebook posts with pictures get 35% more clicks and, post that has questions get 70% more engagement. And it seems like the tendency is basically the more things that are being, the more you're being like things are coming at you like.
Bombard people, bombard
Yeah.
people.
So I don't know if they're just kind of going off that assumption that like, oh, video is always going to be better. People love watching things.
See, if you look at Facebook analytics, though, I mean, typically videos don't do as well as photographs. Because people don't want to spend the time sitting around watching something. I mean, we live in such a, go society that.
Right, so it would be very interesting to see an ad that linked to just a page with photographs and the possibility of ordering a starter kit. That would be interesting comparison. But as far as I know, no one's done it. So the next thing we were going to talk about was studies that try to measure whether we're having an impact at all. And what is the state of the progress of our movement? And one thing is that we are always, as people, trying to know whether we're having an impact with our actions. And we need to feel like we're having an impact if we're going to continue doing those actions. So we look around and we try to find information that's going to reinforce the belief that we are having an impact, that we are doing something useful in whatever field of our life you want to talk about. Because we don't want to feel that life is pointless, right? We don't want to be like, well, I got up, I did all that stuff, it was kind of hard, I could just as well lay in bed. And some of that information that we get from the world in this constant search is really useful information. But mostly we don't put it through our analytical filters that say, well, would that really have happened without me here? Well, am I just noticing the one person who came up to me and said that was awesome and discounting the other 30 people who walked by me and were annoyed by my presence? Because that's not what psychologically we need to keep going. And if we don't have a really strong commitment to knowing which thing we're doing is more effective, it's not helpful to us on a day-to-day basis to notice the negative feedback equally as much as the positive feedback. So making some kind of attempt to create a framework for seeing all the feedback is a way of countering that bias that we go through the world with, that like we are useful and helpful people. Because we want to be useful and helpful people, but we also want to be as useful and helpful as possible. We don't want to think we're useful and helpful people also when we're doing nothing useful, just as much as when we're making a huge difference. We want there to be a difference in feedback for us. So that can be as simple as designating one day, one event, where we really like look around and make tally marks for people who look engaged by what we're doing and tally marks for people who don't look engaged. And it can be as complicated as running huge controlled studies compared to placebos, right? But any of these measurements are a way of saying, well, I know that my personal vision of the world is not perfectly accurate. So I want some kind of framework to help me keep track of things.
Yeah, this connects back with the point, one of the points Wayne made in his blog post about the kind of issues with studies and observer bias. And the idea that like, observer bias is with you always, right? And it's probably less, like it's always going to be an issue in studies, and there's like ways to address that with studies, but it's probably less of an issue with studies than with not doing studies.
We're all observers.
Oh, cool. So this is a, I feel like the, yeah.
Do you not have anyone?
Not yet. Like, so the idea, okay, this is switching text a little bit, and the idea is kind of measuring progress along the track of the movement, right? So this is an example not from animal rights, but from, next slide. From increasing support for gay marriage, right? So a bunch of states now have gay marriage, and just to kind of to get some perspective on that movement, it'd be interesting to know how much of that so I think we all kind of intuitively know, and this is true, that young people tend to support gay marriage more than older people. That's a trend. And also that there's been more support for gay marriage over time than there used to be. So how much of that increasing support for gay marriage is due to like actually convincing anyone that gay marriage should be allowed, versus just the people who oppose gay marriage dying, and more of the people who are in favor of gay marriage kind of getting older, right? So it's I don't have any concrete examples of what particular decisions you'd make differently if you know this versus don't know this if you're in this movement, but I think it makes a difference for kind of priorities and what you focus on. So this is a chart of the proportion of people supporting gay marriage in each generation over time. So we're tracking people in a particular range of birth dates over time. And what we see is that both effects are present. So if you isolate to the people in a particular age range, whichever age range it is, we're seeing a trend of increasing support for gay marriage. But we're also seeing the effect that I mentioned at the beginning, that like younger people tend to support gay marriage more. So it's about, if you look at the numbers, it turns out to be about half and half, kind of half of the effect is due to people becoming convinced that gay marriage should be allowed. And the other half is due to just population turnover. So it's just not an example from animal rights, but kind of the same kind of thing you might want to think about when you're thinking about what are the trends in support for your movement.
This might be a question that's a little too finely grained, but do you know what the explanation for is for the apparent drop in support? From like 51 to 40 among the young people?
I actually don't know.
And how did they, and if there is an explanation, how did they determine that was the appropriate explanation? Or is it just statistical variances? If we look back 10 years, are we saying the same sort of, movement for like 10, 20 years?
I think the sample sizes are large enough that it's not just statistical variance, but I think there probably was some event, but I don't know what it was.
But it also could be like a different pool, right? Different polling groups tend to find different things.
Yeah, it could be. I'm not sure.
That's really fascinating to me, because that would give us just more or less steady progress until, I think there has been
Yeah,
some sort of
I mean,
systemic...
relatively steady progress, but yeah. Next. Yeah.
You should go back in the next slide. Alright, so another example, and this one should be very relevant to DxE, is we could count how many people come to each protest we hold. And, we would think we were having an impact, our movement is growing if an increasing number of people come to our protest. And this is a really popular measure in the media. If you search how many people came to protest, you see all kinds of different examples. There's like Glenn Beck's rally, there's Occupy Wall Street, there's Trayvon Martin protests. But the most famous example is the Million Men March, which of course is asking for this kind of analysis, because they named it the Million Men March, success of having a million men show up. So this was super controversial at the time, which was in the early 90s. Because the organizers of the march were like, yeah, afterwards 1.5 to 2 million people came to our march, but they held it in Washington, D.C., of course, in this public land, and the National Park Service was charged with estimating how many people were there as part of their park maintenance duties, and they estimated that 400,000 people were there. So then the organizers were really mad at the National Park Service, and the National Park Service was really insulted that the organizers didn't believe them. And the media ended up paying for these researchers at Boston University to come up with another estimate. And they ended up with, I think, about 875,000 people being at the march. But it's kind of like, they took photos of the march that the National Park Service had taken actually, and they divided them into different areas and counted how densely populated they thought each little area on the mall was, and added up how many people that would be. So it can be really hard, even to make this really simple measurement of how many people came to your events once your events grow. Or we were talking with Wayne and Chris earlier of counting how many events are happening. If those events are happening in a diffuse space, and if there get to be a lot, that can just be tabulating an enormous amount of data. Even for very simple measurements.
So this is another, like we're going through these different like goals we might want to accomplish with measurements, and so I'm kind of talking through different examples of each. And then another thing you might want to measure is kind of what is the makeup of our movement? What kind of people are supporting this? What do they think? So I wanted to cover this, like what kind of thing would that be useful for? One, we were talking in the kind of discussion before the talk started, is about someone asked how do you figure out what was the important thing in like historical, like in the civil rights, like how important were protests versus other avenues to progress? And I think one of the ways to start making historical comparisons is to try to figure out what historical movements are we similar to, and what happened to those, like what worked for them and what didn't work for them. And, like that's about I think that's about two things. It's like making these comparisons is partly about like what are our goals, like what are we trying to accomplish with what sorts of methods, and who are we? What kind of people are we? What do we think? And then kind of studying historically similar things from there. So one way that can be hard, like this is just an example showing that asking people like what their makeup is or what they're similar to is not always going to get you the right answer. So like, not an animal rights example, but there's always these like college peer rankings, and colleges are asked to like report which other colleges are their like, peer colleges. And like the colleges always, and there's a link in the notes, maybe I'll send the presentation around later to an article about this, but like the colleges do not report peer colleges, they report aspirational peer colleges. So the next slide.
They're all peers with either Harvard or UC Berkeley.
No, if they're little colleges, like Williams or
Swarthmore.
So this is I won't get into a lot of detail of this particular study, but I think it could be interesting to look at in more detail. And I'd love to see an update since 1998 was a long time ago. But this is a study looking at kind of changes in the animal rights movement from 1990 to 98 that Wayne sent me. And I guess I won't talk about any of the numbers or any like definitive conclusions, but I thought it was pretty interesting that kind of the changes, more people becoming to prioritize animal agriculture in the movement versus other things that are bad happening to animals. More people in the movement becoming vegetarian or vegan from 90 to 98. Which, I don't know, to me those are pretty good signs, because I think animal agriculture is pretty important, and like people being vegan or vegetarian is like a pretty good sign to kind of support their engagement. The next slide. So there's a link to that study in the notes on the slide, which Wayne will send out later. And then I guess we just wanted to have a bit of discussion, see what kind of questions people want to talk about. Like I said, maybe this isn't the time for it, maybe it is. It's like figuring out kind of what is that path that we're imagining and being kind of precise about it, and Mark like figuring out what we can measure along the way. Other things we might talk about, like, so there's always a cost of measuring something. So if Jack can give you something else, you could do it. So how do you weight the cost and benefits? We were talking about a bunch of stuff earlier. Other stuff people want to talk about?
So if time for discussion, maybe we should turn that.
I would actually like to record the discussion if people are okay with that. Is everyone okay with that?
Right.
So I keep reading these psychology studies, like 140 people were asked whether if someone talked to you about environmentalism who is an environmentalist as opposed to who is just a normal person, the such and such people are going to say that they are more open to the message, and therefore that means that people think vegans are assholes. But I'm like, what? And people really state this as a study to base on, and basically I think their reasoning is that people think that other people telling you what's right is them being an asshole. But it just seems like generalizing way lots of very little information to something that's very, very different.
Yeah, and then maybe it's also measuring the wrong kind of path. They're not necessarily the wrong path, but maybe not the path to success that you imagine, right? So maybe they think you're an asshole is one of the first steps to like kind of change your studies.
Right. That might be a good thing.
Yeah.
So, but my question is, can you generalize at all, or how can you decide how to generalize from something like earlier I asked about the civil rights movement? How can you decide what's a good generalization?
Yeah, or you have to generalizing from the videos too.
Yeah, and you're generalizing from the videos. Because a lot of it, I think, what we go on comes from other kinds of evidence.
Right, so one really good key sign is that if you see multiple distinct studies pointing to the same idea, that's a sign that these studies might be generalizable. So in particular the study about are you more likely to listen to someone identified as an environmentalist or someone just like not really identified? That actually is part of a body of literature about people having negative perceptions of activists in general. And so that might be something that can be generalized.
So that's one among many studies.
Right. But then again, there's many movements that are made up of activists that eventually succeed. So it might not be the case that because people don't like activists, activism is useless.
Right.
That's a different question.
Yeah, I think like part of why a lot of activists and activist groups may not want to do studies because there is some cost, however much that cost is, and they're already very convinced that what they're doing is the right thing. And so I think that they may feel like the possible benefit is almost to zero. And if it has any cost at all, they don't want to do it.
Right. I think one answer to that is that's a really salient point often for measuring your impact, because that often has a cost and it doesn't have a clear action point after you've measured it. What are you going to do differently? Something like A/B testing, where you're trying to measure which of these like pretty similar things we could do is more effective. It's more clear once you've spent this non-zero amount of energy on this project how that can actually make you a more effective activist in the future and what you would do differently and how you might be more effective with your same amount of energy later.
Yeah.
And my impression about like good opportunities, I mean, kind of follow along the lines of what you two were talking about, that especially when dealing with like a web-based activity, that because there's so many tools which are already like built into like a lot of like social media sites and stuff like that, you have that data so easily available that it makes those costs of study so much lower. And you also have like sample sizes which are larger, and then you can like do better, tests and stuff like that. But it's, I mean, I feel like trying to do a study, I mean, you were using this as an example of like, oh, we did this type of event, and then like how many people came out to like the subsequent meeting or something. Even if that was done like in a systematic way, I feel like it's, I mean, it's not very hard to tally, be like, boop, 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 12 people. Like that's not a hard thing to do. But then again, it also seems like there's going to be so many other variables at play. Like, is that really,
Right.
you may give a false sense of like knowledge,
It's hard to get to a point where you've done enough actions and had enough meetings that data starts to fall into patterns that aren't just random variation, or the fact that you have a topic for every meeting and different topics draw more people, or things like that. Studies in the online world are so much easier than studies in the physical world. So much easier.
So I have a question that I don't know if we can answer today, but I think is worth thinking about, and that is, I think measuring is very important, and I think determining what your model is very important. The concern I have is and this is a concern about, I don't know if anyone is aware of gamification, and this idea of gamification. A lot of employers are trying to kind of make their work more like games and have like very concrete measures for their employees to measure their own progress, because if you feel like you're making progress, it just makes you feel better at your job. But one of the reasons gamification, this notion that you can set out like very clear measures of incremental progress for your employees doesn't work so well is that a lot of employers have found that their employees end up gaming the gamification. Right? So if you decide that your measure of progress is how many leaflets do I hand out, and someone who is just concerned about handing leaflets just starts throwing them out. Just give them to everyone and maybe even throw some leaflets away and just pretends that he, so there's two different problems. One is just that they start doing things that the other one have done that actually have no value for progress, that just help them improve their measurement. And the second is that there's actual fraud. And so I wonder how big of a problem anyone here, including David and Al, think that is, and what we can do about it if it is a problem. So, and part of it is just like the strictly pragmatic problem as to whether we're actually obtaining data that's sound, and the other problem is just conceptually whether it changes the culture of the group, so we start focusing on the measured variables instead of the broader outcomes that we're actually trying to achieve. And you see the same criticism in standardized testing, where people say like, oh, once you impose standardized testing, the teachers just teach the test, and what we should really be trying to build is, good citizens and thoughtful students.
So one way of addressing that is to take the measurement out of the foreground of at least most people's experience of the movement. If some part of the organizers are thinking about measuring and are going through the process of measuring, but they aren't even necessarily sharing that information that they are measuring stuff with the whole movement,
It doesn't become a part of the culture.
then it can't become a part of the whole culture. And also, if they're not constantly reporting to the other organizers what they measured today and what they measured tomorrow and what they measured last week, then the other organizers are not able to know what's gaming the system as often and aren't thinking about it all the time. So something like automatic measurements that you get online is really good for this, because maybe no one is looking at that analytics page for a long time. Of course, in the physical world, someone's going to need to be counting who came to the meeting if that's a measurement you decided to make. But you don't need to all count, and you don't need to immediately publish to everyone the number.
And again, dynamic can be positive. Like you were saying, you're talking about the different organizers in different cities. We're playing this on you recently, but different organizers in different cities kind of competing for how many people would come to their march for the Earth March. That sounds like a positive, healthy competition.
Yeah, I mean, the example Blaine was using, I can see that there's always going to be like a possibility for like people going like, you really want to compete on this metric, and that kind of gets you a little bit off task. I feel like given the nature of like the movement, and that this isn't like, it's not like anyone's like getting like really tangible rewards, or like not,
It's not tied to your bonus.
Right, yeah, it's not like, you're going to get, or I shouldn't say not anyone, but, generally speaking. And so I feel like that's less than an issue, but yeah, that if you're focusing on quantitative measures, then you can lose sight of like the substance, and like, you're talking about leaf setting, like, I could have like had that nice conversation with someone, but instead of like talking to them and like sharing my story, I was like, sorry, gotta go, keep going. So, and I think very consciously, but I feel like, and I don't work for the average, but I feel like people who like do a lot of leafleting are pretty aware of like that trade-off. I don't think it's something that like, I don't know, that is set in stone, and I can't imagine that, I don't know, I'm a little less worried than you are in that sense, that like, considering how few metrics we have now and how few measurements, it's hard to imagine that like we jump from like not measuring anything to like being super goal obsessed, or like,
Well, having just vegan outreach, like I think like a couple weeks ago, we went to this college, and apparently it was like the most leaflets handed out in like, ever, and like they were super, the guys who like paid to work, they were super happy and stuff. But like I'm almost positive that at least half of those leaflets were on the ground because people were genuinely just throwing them on the ground. So first of all, you can't say that. And I'm not gonna put down leaflets because the last time I did that, like everyone got mad at me. So I'm not gonna, but I'm just gonna give like the facts here. Like at least I'm gonna say, okay, maybe I'm being dramatic. Maybe 30% were like just on the ground. Like just people were just throwing them around. So like to say that, oh, this is like such a progressive school, like someone needs to hand it out, like that's not really accurate. And on top of that, like they say things like for every leaflet you hand out, for every 2 leaflets you hand out, that's like 1 animal saved. But that too is a little, because at some points you're basically, I've seen, because I've leafleted so much, like at some points you're just forcing leaflets on people. And they're going to throw them out, and you know they're going to throw them out. But to say like, oh, as long as we get enough out, like no, shouldn't you just be focused on the people who actually want to take the leaflet, not just like shoving it at people because then 2 seconds later it's in the trash. So there's so many flaws.
Yeah, I think this is a good example, and I've actually done a huge amount of leafleting, and I think there are a lot of really great people who do leafleting for various organizations, but as someone who has leafleted, typically the only number that gets reported to the mailing list afterwards is just the number of leaflets that went out, right? And there's literally an order of magnitude difference between the number of leaflets you can get out if you take a very aggressive approach and just hand it to everyone, or if you try and be thoughtful and have conversations with people. I mean, I remember, like, I'd spend an hour and sometimes only get 30 leaflets out. Some people would get 300 out. I mean, swear to God, that's a difference. And you know, that isn't really what the outcome that we're trying to get at is not the number of leaflets getting handed out. And to the extent that becomes part of it, I agree with you completely in the sense that I don't think it's a huge problem yet because there aren't too many organizations that are even trying to measure, right? And so, in a sense, I think Vegan Outreach is doing a good thing in even trying to set up a measurement that we can look to. The problem is, if you're dealing with a very, very complex system and any particular variable that you could measure is not going to be representative of your actual goal, and if focusing on that measurement is not necessarily helpful because it can distract you from the goal and focus you just on the measurement instead of the outcome that you're trying to achieve, that's where the problem exists. But I don't know how big a problem it is either, because I think you're right.
As both of you were talking about this, I was thinking like more than, I mean, it's not right, this isn't really about leafleting per se, but it's about like the numbers that are reported and how useful are those reported numbers.
Sure.
And so to tie it in more with like the talk, you know, it's basically that like we're using this variable, leaflets handed out, and like trying to use it as a proxy for change, for people going vegetarian, for people going vegan, for people becoming activists. And I mean, I think it's pretty clear that like that number is a pretty weak, you know, indicator, and that like this video study, you know, I mean, I could imagine like that there would be ways, let's say, to measure leafleting, which would be much better. Like, you know, there's a QR code on the back, and then someone scans it. And so it's like, how many scans did we get compared to how many leaflets we handed out that day? You know? And it's like maybe, you know, it's tied in with the GPS, you know, location thing. So it's like, in this region, so we're getting like more specific, you know, just that variable or that number is not very good.
Or some other call to action that the leaflet has to do.
Yeah.
Send a message to someone, or if
they
they're supposed
scan
to
and they share it on
the
Facebook,
requests
something like
for,
that.
you know, they do the requests for,
For starter kits, food leaflets also.
right. And so like that's a bet, you know, maybe that's the better number. And the report, right, the one you see on the chart is the number of leaflets going out, but maybe the number of requests for a guide to cruelty-free eating, that's the better number, you know? And
But
so,
I mean, those are still unsatisfying because most people just take a leaflet and they Google, you know, animal ag, like, you know, so I feel like that's the issue with leaflets and connecting it, like, because Vegan Outreach has connected leaflets handed out to number of animals saved, and like, I've always wanted to see like the data that went into that, because that seems highly questionable.
Right, so right before we go, I'm going to give you a brief window into that data. So at a few places where leaflets have been distributed, they've done surveys where they went back later to the campus and asked people, did you receive a leaflet, and are you a vegetarian, and maybe some other questions too. But the number of animals saved is tied to the percentage of people who received a leaflet who said they were vegetarian compared to the percentage of people who, well, ideally, we would also tally the things that people who didn't receive a leaflet said, but I think the existing studies actually don't. But we're working on a better one that does.
So they could coincidentally have gone vegetarian.
Right, so some of them probably went vegetarian coincidentally, but probably not that many.
And also, there's the misreporting issue where people oftentimes say they're vegetarian when they're not.
So there's a lot of room for improvement in those numbers. But they do go back and they ask, you know, how many of the people that say they received leaflets also say they're vegetarian. And then they convert that to the number of animals saved based on the average meat consumption of people in the U.S., which is, again, there's room for a question here because maybe people who go vegetarian were already eating fewer animals. But there's also room for question in the other direction, which is that maybe people receive the pamphlet and eat fewer animals as a result that don't go vegetarian and don't report going vegetarian because what they're doing is they're eating less meat and they're thinking more about animal issues, but they're not ready to make these big changes yet. So there's a lot of room for improvement in our understanding of what happens as people are hearing about factory farming and starting to make decisions about what they, in response to that, can do. And we don't know what people do, really.
One point I want to emphasize is that I think leafleting is a useful lens for us to examine some of the difficulties that Al and David have talked about, but they apply just as much to any sort of other measurement we might employ. So for example, if we decided to measure how many people came to protest and that became kind of a dominant part of our culture, maybe we do things like, you know, have like images of beautiful women stripping their clothes and get lots of people to come to a protest that, I mean, there's no plausible effect on the movement, we're playing to the measure, we're playing to the standard instead of actually trying to achieve change. So anytime you involve any sort of measurement that's different from your ultimate objective, which to me is saving animals, physically taking animals out of horrendous conditions, putting them into happy places, then you create at least the possibility of this problem, where you play to the measurement instead of to the objective. So, we see this all the time in the legal world too, incidentally. This is one of the reasons why I think it's a big problem, because legal world, almost everything is evaluated by the billable hour. And even within firms, you recognize that how many hours you bill doesn't represent how much value you've added to your client, you've provided to your client. And so what they do is they generally give you a minimum billable hour requirement because they think, well, everyone should hit this requirement. But beyond that, we'll evaluate your performance on the basis of more subjective criteria. But the reality is, all that stuff gets thrown away. And basically the only way associates get evaluated in law firms is how many hours have you billed. That's what determines bonus, that determines whether you get promoted, everything. And there's some subjective measurements. Basically, it's a framing that set an anchoring point, and they'll make some variation based on that. Like, oh, if our clients say good things about you, we'll give you a little more, a little less. But because they've set this strong kind of empirical way to measure the value of associate performance, in my view, they're doing something bad for the firm culture and for our clients. Whether that can extend to activism, I don't know. But I just think it's a problem you have to be sensitive to. Especially if you know how much time lawyers waste. Things they shouldn't be doing.
So I think the Billion Lives Saved tour has done a lot of studies, is that correct?
Yeah, so that's the Found 10 Billion Lives campaign.
Yeah.
And they're actually doing, part of their model of how they're affecting people is that they reach out to people who've taken the pledge at intervals to provide them with more information and more resources. And so they also ask for feedback from them at that time, like, what are you eating now? So they actually are one of the groups that has the largest amount of data about what's happening for people they've reached out to. Unfortunately, there's certainly, like, they're not at all subtle about the fact that this is the 10 Billion Lives Tour contacting you to ask you about how much meat you're eating. So you are, when you see that survey, tempted to report that you're eating meat because you know what they think about you.
Well, that's the feature of some of the studies you're planning, is to not, like, for that bias, like,
Right.
what the
So
study, what the observer wants to see.
effective animal activism is now running a couple of studies, one on leafleting and one on humane education lectures, where we follow up with people who've received leaflets or leaflets about puppy mills, which are another animal issue, but obviously not really diet related, or who have or haven't seen humane education lectures. And we'll be contacting them with these surveys, not saying who's giving the survey and not saying it's connected to this thing until after they've already told us what they're eating.
But won't they automatically assume that it's somebody, some animal rights associated group that wants to know?
Well, we're trying to frame them as general diet surveys. So we're asking how many times a week do you eat vegetables, as well as how many times a week do you eat red meat? How many times a week do you drink caffeinated beverages? That kind of thing. So that it's not obvious from the start what piece of information here we're looking at. Obviously, when we analyze this data, we aren't going to care how many times they drink caffeinated beverages, but they don't notice.
Right. And then the humane lecture, is that it? I'm not familiar with humane lecture.
There's a variety of programs. There's a group, the Factory Farm Awareness Coalition in the Bay Area running these. They come to classrooms at teacher invitations.
Oh, presenter.
Great, so you actually know exactly what's going on. You give these lectures. So for other people, teachers will invite people from these groups to come and tell the students about the implications of factory farming for animals, for the environment, for social justice, etc.
And so you guys are actually contacting the students that were in those lectures and asking them questions?
Right. So we're having presenters collect email addresses for us to use to give them an online survey in a couple of months.
As compared with like students who didn't get lectures?
Right. We're also recruiting students who didn't get lectures outside of those classes, obviously.
Control variable.
I think I have to go.
I should go too.
To go also. But this was great.
Thank you very much.
One more quick question, just about like your organization. Who are you? Who's
So-
your funding?
Our organization is Effective Animal Activism. We right now have, I think, private donors as our funding. Mostly people who feel really strongly about the importance of measurement and improving understanding of what's going on.
And are you like are you affiliated with the university? Or are you a nonprofit? Like what?
We're a nonprofit.
Okay.
We are affiliated with the Center for Effective Altruism in Oxford.
Okay. And when you do surveys, you have to do all that with universities when you do human research.
We don't have an institutional review board process because none of us are involved in institutions receiving federal funding for research, which is where institutional review boards come from.
Okay. And this is kind of just out of curiosity because of this self-reporting bias based on what people think, you know, what they perceive as who are questioning them. Have you ever done anything to explicitly, or do you know of any studies that explicitly like try to investigate how strong that affects results, how strongly that reflects? Yeah.
I think
Like, if you, could you represent yourself as a meat lobby, for example, for a questionnaire?
Usually, if we were that deliberately misrepresentative, a lot of people in and related to our organization would probably be pretty annoyed with us.
Well, I mean, maybe more subtly.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess you're doing that sort of by saying that you're just interested in general dietary stuff. It's more of a neutral position.
So we're trying to take a neutral position.
Okay.
There's a huge literature on this sort of subject outside of the performance context, and they found big effects.
Yeah.
Even with every domain, including, as I was saying, even in the hard sciences.
There's huge effects everywhere.
Thank you.
Thank you.